Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to this quiet corner of history. Before we begin our journey tonight, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever you are in the world. Whether you are lying in the dark with your phone resting on the pillow beside you, or sitting in a comfortable chair with a warm drink in your hands, or somewhere in between waking and sleep, drifting at that pleasant edge where thoughts soften and the day begins to let you go. I am so glad you found your way here. If you would like, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. It is always such a wonderful thing to see how far and wide this community of quiet history lovers stretches across the globe. And if this kind of slow, immersive storytelling is something you find comforting, please do consider subscribing so that you never miss another journey into the past. Tonight we are going somewhere extraordinary. Somewhere that exists now only in the pages of old scrolls, in the faded ink of woodblock prints, in the lacquered objects and crumbling temple walls that have survived the centuries to tell us something about how life was lived. We are going to medieval Japan. We are going to a world of rice paddies and mountain temples, of samurai and monks, of farmers and craftsmen and merchants and poets, of cherry blossoms falling over castle courtyards and winter snow settling in perfect silence on thatched rooftops. A world that was, in many ways, entirely unlike anything in the medieval West that we have explored together before, and yet was in other ways deeply, recognizably human, shaped by the same fundamental questions about how to live, how to find meaning, how to face hardship and impermanence with something approaching grace. So let your breathing slow. Let the sounds around you soften. Let whatever weight the day has placed on your shoulders begin to release, very gently, into the dark. And come with me to Japan. Not the Japan of bullet trains and neon-lit cities, but an older Japan, a quieter Japan, a Japan that exists now in the imagination and in the careful scholarship of those who have devoted their lives to understanding it. A Japan of mist-covered mountains and cedar forests and narrow paths winding between rice paddies where a farmer and his oxen move in the same slow rhythm that their ancestors moved in 100 years before. We are going to spend a long time there tonight. Long enough to understand something of the texture of that world, the way it felt to live inside it, the particular quality of its beauty and its hardship and its moments of unexpected grace. Let us begin. Part 1. The land itself. Picture, if you will, the islands of Japan as they appeared in the medieval period, roughly between the 12th and 16th centuries. 4 main islands and thousands of smaller ones, arranged in a long, curved arc in the western Pacific, rising steeply from the sea in a landscape so mountainous that nearly 80% of the total land area is too steep for farming. The mountains are not gentle hills, but dramatic eruptions of stone and forest, their peaks often hidden in cloud, their slopes covered in deep cedar and pine forests that in many places had never been cleared, had never seen an axe, were as wild and unknowable as they had been in the first days of the world. Between the mountains and the sea lay the narrow coastal plains and valley floors, and it was here that nearly all human life happened. It was here that the rice paddies were carved out of the land with extraordinary patience and ingenuity, terraced up the lower slopes of the mountains in steps that caught and held the water that rice requires, creating landscapes that were at once entirely artificial and entirely beautiful, shaped by human hands over generations until they looked like something that had always been there. The terraces followed the contours of the hills in curves as natural as a river's bend, and in the season when the paddies were flooded and the young rice plants were just beginning to show their green above the still water, They caught the sky and the clouds and reflected them back in a shimmer of silver and blue that made the whole valley look like a painting that had not yet decided which way was up. The climate of Japan in the medieval period was not so different from today, which is to say, it was varied and often dramatic. The islands stretch far enough from north to south that the northern island of what is now Hokkaido experienced long and genuinely brutal winters, with heavy snowfall and temperatures well below freezing, while the southern islands and the lower Pacific coast had a climate that was warm and wet and subtropical in character. Between these extremes, the majority of the population lived in a climate that had 4 distinct seasons, each one arriving with its own particular character and its own particular demands on the people who lived through it. The Japanese relationship with the seasons was and remains something deeply woven into the culture in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. It was not merely agricultural, not merely the practical awareness that winter means cold and summer means heat. It was aesthetic, philosophical, spiritual. The seasons were not just things that happened to you. They were teachers. They were reminders of the transience of everything beautiful, which was also the transience of everything painful. The cherry blossoms were beautiful precisely because they lasted only a week or two before the petals fell. The autumn leaves were beautiful precisely because their brilliance was the last brightness before winter. The first snow was beautiful precisely because it covered everything in white silence and reminded you that the world was capable of being made new. This sensibility, this sensitivity to the passing of natural things as a source of both sadness and beauty, was called mono no aware in Japanese, which translates imperfectly as the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the pathos of things. It was not a formal philosophy taught in schools. It was something absorbed from the culture itself, from the art and the poetry and the religious teachings, and the simple fact of living close to a natural world that was constantly quietly insisting on its own impermanence. We will return to this idea many times tonight, because it shaped almost everything about life in medieval Japan. From the way people built their houses, to the way they fought their wars, to the way a peasant woman in a wet rice paddy paused for a moment to watch a heron lifting slowly from the flooded field, and felt something that she may not have had precise words for, but that was nonetheless real and important and fully human. Part 2. The Rice and the People. Let us come down from the mountains now and walk into the valley, and let us find the village that sits at the place where the river widens, and the valley floor is broad enough to hold a settlement of some size. It is early morning in late spring, and the air smells of water and green things, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from cooking fires that have been lit since before dawn. The village is called something that translates roughly as River Bend Village, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how medieval Japanese villages named themselves, which was with a simplicity and directness that reflected the importance of landscape and geography to people who spent their entire lives in one place. The river was not a detail of the village. The river was one of the reasons the village existed at all, and naming the village after its relationship to the river was as natural as naming a child after the season in which it was born. There are perhaps 40 households in this village. Each household is a family unit of several generations, grandparents and parents and children, and sometimes an unmarried aunt or a younger brother who has not yet established his own family, all living together in a farmhouse that is large by the standards of the era, but that would seem very small by ours. The house is built of wood and plaster, and has a thatched roof of deep, dense thatch that overhangs the walls generously to keep the rain from driving in. The floors inside are raised above the ground on wooden sills, and most of the interior space is covered with woven rice straw mats, which we know today as tatami, laid flat and even across the floor, defining the domestic space with a particular softness and warmth, and that characteristic smell of dried grass that anyone who has spent time in a traditional Japanese interior will recognize immediately. There is a central hearth, a square opening in the floor where a fire is kept burning through the cold months, and where cooking is done in large clay and iron pots. The smoke from this hearth rises through the interior of the house and exits through gaps in the thatch at the ridge of the roof, blackening the underside of the thatch over the years until it becomes dark and tarry and actually more resistant to fire and insects than fresh thatch would be. This blackened thatch was a sign of an established household, a house that had been lived in for a generation or more, and it was regarded with the particular respect that medieval Japanese society reserved for things that had proven their worth through time. Imagine a woman named Hana, which means flower, who rises before the sun every morning of her life to begin the work of feeding her household. She is perhaps 35 years old, though like so many women of her era, she looks older than she is. Her hands roughened from constant work, her face weathered from years in the fields. She has 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging from 6 years old to 14. Her husband, a man named Kenji, is the village headman, which gives the family a degree of status but not a corresponding degree of freedom from labor. The headman of a medieval Japanese village was responsible for organizing the collective agricultural work, for collecting and delivering the portion of the harvest owed to the Lord, for mediating disputes between neighbors, and for 100 other administrative and social duties that sat on top of, rather than instead of, the ordinary work of farming. Hana rises in the dark and lights the fire and begins heating water and preparing the morning meal, which is rice, always rice, sometimes with pickled vegetables on the side, sometimes with a small amount of dried fish if the family can afford it. Rice is not simply the staple food of medieval Japan. It is the foundation of the entire economic and social order. It is what rents and taxes are paid in. It is how wealth is measured. A domain's power is calculated in the amount of rice it produces, expressed in units called koku, with 1 koku being roughly the amount of rice needed to feed 1 person for 1 year. The entire feudal hierarchy of medieval Japan, from the emperor to the lowest farmer, is in some sense a system for organizing the production and distribution of rice. Hana knows this not as an abstraction, but as the most concrete fact of her life. The rice she grows determines whether her family eats adequately or goes hungry. The portion she must deliver to the Lord's representative each autumn determines how much is left for her own family's use. The quality of the harvest depends on the weather, on the irrigation channels remaining clear, on the collective labor of the village being organized effectively and completed on time, and on a degree of luck with pests and disease that no amount of effort can fully control. She has lived through 2 bad harvests in her adult life, and the memory of those years, of the calculated rationing of what little remained, of the particular hollow quality of children's hunger, sits in her permanently, informing every decision she makes about food with a kind of quiet urgency that people who have never known real scarcity cannot fully understand. The children wake as the light begins to show through the thin paper screens of the windows. In a medieval Japanese house, the interior walls are not solid plaster or wood, but screens of translucent paper stretched over light wooden frames. And when the morning light comes, they glow softly from the outside, filling the interior with a diffused brightness that has no shadows and no sharp edges, that makes everything inside look like it is lit from within. This quality of light is one of the things that medieval Japanese poets and artists return to repeatedly, trying to capture in ink and words that particular quality of morning in a paper-walled house, when the outside world announces itself not with the bluntness of direct sunlight, but with this gentle, even, sourceless glow. The children dress quickly in the cool morning air. Their clothing is simple, practical, made of cotton and hemp woven in the household. The older children will work in the fields today, joining the adults in the endless tasks of rice cultivation. The youngest will stay near the house with grandmother, who is too old for heavy field work but still vital to the household, managing the domestic tasks, minding the young children, preserving the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of making do. Part 3. The Rhythm of the Rice. The cultivation of rice in medieval Japan was one of the most labor-intensive forms of agriculture ever practiced by human beings, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything else about the society that it supported. Rice cannot be grown in the way that wheat or barley can be grown, scattered across a dry field and left to the rain. It requires standing water for a significant part of its growing season, which means the paddies must be flooded, maintained at the correct water level, and then drained at the right time, all of which requires a sophisticated irrigation infrastructure of channels and sluices and dikes that must be maintained collectively, because no individual farmer can maintain them alone. The work begins in spring when the paddies must be prepared. The winter has left the fields dry, and the soil must be broken up and turned, the dikes and channels inspected and repaired where the winter has damaged them. Then the water must be let in, and the field flooded to the correct depth, and the soil must be worked again while flooded, churned into a smooth mud by human feet and animal hooves. The distinctive, unpleasant richness of the flooded paddy filling the nostrils of everyone working in it. This process was performed in community, all the households of the village working together field by field, rotating from one family's land to the next, because the sheer physical labor of preparing a paddy for planting is more than any single family can accomplish alone in the narrow window of time available before the planting season closes. Picture Kenji, Hana's husband, standing knee-deep in the flooded paddy in the early morning cold, his trousers rolled up to his thighs, working the soil with a long-handled implement, his breath misting in the cool spring air. Around him are a dozen other men and women doing the same work, and the sound of the village at this season is the sound of this work, the splash and suck of feet in mud, the creak of tools, the occasional exchange of words between neighbors that is also a form of relief, the small sociality that makes physical hardship bearable. The planting of the rice seedlings is done in late spring, and it is one of the most demanding physical tasks of the agricultural year. The seedlings have been grown in nursery beds from the previous season's seed, and they must be transplanted by hand into the flooded paddy, one small bundle at a time, pressed into the mud at precise intervals that the experienced farmer judges by eye without measuring, walking backward through the flooded field, bending and placing, in a motion so repetitive that it becomes almost meditative, the mind emptying of everything except the next plant, and the next, and the next, while the back aches and the legs are cold and the sun climbs and the day gets long. The planting was traditionally done by women more than men, and the women who did it developed a technique and a rhythm and a particular quality of endurance that the culture recognized and celebrated, though celebration did not make the work less hard. There were songs sung during rice planting, transplanting songs with a slow, steady rhythm that matched the rhythm of the work, that helped maintain the pace through the long hours, that were in some sense a form of collective hypnosis, a way of keeping the mind and body moving when the rational mind would have preferred to stop. One of the women planting rice in the paddy alongside Hana is a woman named Yuki, which means snow. She is the village's most skilled rice farmer, known for her eye for uniform spacing and her ability to work for hours without slowing. She is also known for the quality of her singing voice and her knowledge of the old planting songs, many of which she learned from her own mother, who learned them from hers. When Yuki begins to sing in the flooded paddy, the other women fall into the rhythm of her voice, and the work becomes something different, something that is both labor and music, both suffering and grace, and the sound of it carries across the valley in the still spring air. This is not a small thing. The songs were not merely entertainment or distraction. They were a technology, a way of coordinating collective labor, of managing the pace and the endurance of a group of people performing demanding physical work together over many hours. They were also a form of cultural transmission, carrying within them references to the seasons and the landscape and the spiritual beliefs of the community, passing them from one generation to the next in a form that was both practical and beautiful. When Yuki sang the old songs in the rice paddy, she was doing something that connected her to her mother and her great-grandmother all the way back to the first people who had farmed this particular valley, all of them standing in the same cold water, making the same bending motion, singing the same words in voices that were now only echoes. Summer in the rice paddy is a season of maintenance and anxiety. The rice grows quickly once established, the green stalks rising through the standing water, and the work of the farmer shifts from planting to weeding and pest control and water management. The insects that prey on rice were a constant and serious threat, and the methods available to control them were labor-intensive and not always effective. Weeding the paddy required wading through the flooded field, pulling plants that competed with the rice, a task that was endless because weeds are always endless, always returning, always requiring another pass through the field. The summer heat in the Japanese valleys could be oppressive, the humidity from the flooded fields making the air thick and heavy, the sun beating down with a force that the thin clothes of the peasant farmer did little to deflect. Farmers worked from first light until the heat of midday became too much to bear, then rested in whatever shade was available through the worst of the afternoon, then returned to work in the cooler hours of late afternoon and evening. This rhythm of work and rest, shaped by the natural world rather than by any clock, was the fundamental rhythm of medieval Japanese rural life, and it produced a relationship between the body and the day that was intimate in a way that our modern lives, governed by schedules and artificial light, generally are not. Part 4. The Lord and the Peasant. Above the village, though rarely within it in any physical sense, was the Lord. In the medieval Japanese social hierarchy, the farmer occupied a complex and somewhat paradoxical position. In the formal Confucian social theory that had been adopted and adapted from China, farmers were ranked second only to warriors in the social order, above craftsmen and merchants, because farming was the foundation of society and the production of food was the most essential of all human activities. This was the theory. The practice was somewhat different. The farmer worked the land and produced the rice, and a substantial portion of what was produced was owed to the Lord as tax, with the exact percentage varying by time and place, but generally running somewhere between 40 and 60% of the harvest. In bad years, when the harvest was poor, this percentage could mean the difference between bare subsistence and starvation. In very bad years, it sometimes did. The Lord, in the medieval period, meant something much more local and immediate than the distant emperor in Kyoto. Japan in this era was governed in practical terms by a layered system of military lords, the daimyo, each controlling a domain of varying size, each commanding warriors who were loyal to him, each collecting taxes from the farmers within his territory. Above the daimyo, in theory, was the shogun, the military dictator who held power in the name of the emperor. But in practice, the shogun's actual power over the daimyo varied enormously depending on the era and the specific political circumstances. And much of medieval Japanese history is the story of what happened when that power collapsed or was contested. For Kenji, the village headman, the lord was a concrete and present reality, represented most often not by the lord himself, but by the lord's tax collector, who arrived in the village each autumn with a written record of what was owed and an expectation that it would be paid. The tax collector's arrival was one of the pivotal moments of the agricultural year, a moment of calculation and sometimes confrontation, when the headman had to account for the harvest and negotiate, within very narrow limits, the portion that would remain for the village. The negotiation, such as it was, required a specific and carefully calibrated form of social performance. The headman could not simply argue with the tax collector as an equal. The entire social order depended on the maintenance of hierarchical deference, and visible disrespect toward a representative of the lord could have consequences far beyond the individual transaction. At the same time, the headman had a responsibility to his village, to represent as effectively as possible the actual conditions of the harvest and the genuine limits of what the village could deliver without suffering. He had to be both deferential and effective, both visibly submissive and actually firm, a balance that required considerable social intelligence, and that was one of the reasons the headman's position was given to someone with the combination of status, judgment, and communication skills that Kenji possessed. There were years when the tax collector accepted the headman's account and took what had been agreed. There were years when the collector pushed harder, when the lord's own needs were pressing, when the numbers did not add up in a way that satisfied and the atmosphere in the village square grew tense and cold. In the worst cases, in times of famine or extreme political pressure, the demands made on farmers could strip them of enough that children went hungry through the winter, and the weakest members of the community did not survive to see the spring. This was not the norm. It was in no one's long-term interest to destroy the agricultural base on which the entire system depended. But it happened, and the memory of it happening, the knowledge that it could happen, shaped the psychology of the farming community in ways that were deep and permanent. The medieval Japanese peasant lived with an awareness of economic vulnerability that made the comparative security of modern life, even for those who struggle financially in the modern world, almost impossible for us to fully imagine. Part 5. The Warrior's Way. Let us now leave the village and walk a few miles up the valley, past the rice paddies and the mulberry orchards where the silkworms are raised, past the small Shinto shrine that stands at the edge of the settlement where the cultivated land meets the wild forest. And let us come to the small castle compound that sits on a low hill above the valley, commanding a view of the surrounding landscape in every direction. This is not a castle in the European sense, not a massive stone fortress with thick walls and towers. Japanese castle architecture of the medieval period was different in character, built more from wood and plaster than from stone, with distinctive curved roof lines that swept upward at the corners in a way that seemed to reach toward the sky, with multiple levels stepping back as they rose, with white plaster walls that caught the light differently at different times of day. The castle compound was surrounded by walls and a moat, and it housed not just the lord and his family, but a community of warriors, servants, craftsmen, and administrators who made up the functioning apparatus of lordly power. The warriors who lived in and around this compound were the samurai, and they occupied a position in Japanese society that was both more complex and more interesting than the popular image of them suggests. The samurai were, at the most basic level, professional warriors in the service of a lord. Their entire social identity was defined by their martial function and their relationship of loyalty to their master. But the samurai tradition, particularly as it developed through the medieval period, was much more than a martial one. The ideal samurai was not simply a man who could fight well, though fighting well was absolutely essential. He was a man who had cultivated a set of personal qualities and disciplines that extended far beyond physical combat, that included literacy and an appreciation of poetry and the arts, a particular form of meditative awareness cultivated through practices like the tea ceremony and flower arranging, a relationship with Buddhist and Shinto religious practice, and above all, a discipline of mind that allowed him to face death with equanimity. This ideal, which the later tradition would crystallize into the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a formal code written down in a single document. It was a set of values transmitted through culture, through example, through the training of young warriors by older ones, through literature and art and the oral tradition of warrior families. It was also an ideal that the actual behavior of actual samurai fell short of with some regularity, as all ideals and all human beings do, but that nonetheless shaped the aspiration of the warrior class and the culture that the warrior class dominated. Imagine a young samurai named Takeshi, 19 years old, in his third year of service in the household of the lord whose castle sits above the valley. Takeshi is from a minor samurai family in a neighboring domain, placed in service here as part of the network of obligation and patronage that held the feudal system together. He sleeps in the barracks with a dozen other young warriors, rises before dawn for training, spends the morning hours in the practice yard working through sword forms and archery and mounted combat with a seriousness and intensity that outsiders observing it might find almost frightening, and spends the afternoons in quieter pursuits. Today's afternoon pursuit is calligraphy. Takeshi sits at a low writing table in a room that overlooks the inner garden of the castle compound, a garden of raked gravel and carefully pruned pine trees, and a small stone lantern half covered in moss. The garden is designed to be viewed from exactly this angle, from this room at this time of day, and the person who designed it understood what they were doing, because the afternoon light falls on the raked gravel in a way that makes the carefully drawn lines in the gravel stand out in fine relief, and the shadows of the pine branches move slowly across the stones as the light shifts, and the whole thing is as deliberately composed as a painting. Takeshi grinds his ink and prepares his brush and copies a poem he has been given to practice. A poem by a poet who lived 3 centuries earlier and who wrote about autumn and impermanence and the sound of rain on a temple roof. He is not entirely sure he understands the poem. He is not sure he is supposed to understand it in the way you understand a logical argument or a set of instructions. The poem is not trying to explain something. It is trying to point at something, the way you might point at the moon, knowing that your finger is not the moon, but hoping that following the direction of your pointing, the other person's gaze will find it. He copies the poem carefully, attending to each stroke of each character, trying to make the brushwork express something rather than merely record the words. His teacher has told him that in calligraphy, as in swordsmanship, there is no gap between the practitioner and the practice, that the quality of the mind is expressed directly in the movement of the brush or the sword, and that the training of the one is inseparable from the training of the other. This sounds mystical and possibly is, but Takeshi has experienced enough training to understand what it points at. On the mornings when his mind is clear and his body is relaxed and his focus is present without being forced, his sword work flows in a way that it does not on other mornings. Something very similar happens with the brush. He finishes copying the poem and looks at what he has written. It is not good yet. The characters are too careful, too controlled, the marks of someone trying to do it right rather than someone doing it. His teacher would say the trying is the problem. He rolls up the paper and sets it aside and begins again. Part 6. The Buddhist Temple. On the mountainside above the valley, approached by a long stone stairway that climbs through cedar forest from the village below, is a Buddhist temple of moderate size and considerable age. The cedars that line the approach path are enormous, their trunks wider than a man's arm span, their canopies so high that on overcast days they seem to disappear into the cloud, their roots rising from the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. The path is cool even in summer, the light filtering through the cedars in long, dusty shafts that shift as the trees move in any wind. Moss covers every stone surface, green and wet and ancient, giving the entire approach a quality of deep time, of a place that has been sacred for so long that the sacredness has soaked into the physical material of the stones and the trees themselves. The temple was founded, according to its own records, nearly 400 years before our story takes place, by a monk who came to this valley after long wandering in search of a place where the conditions for contemplative practice were right. The records do not specify exactly what conditions he was looking for, but the place he chose suggests something about what he found. The mountain above the temple offered solitude and height, and the particular quality of light that comes from being above the clouds on clear mornings, looking out over a sea of white that covered the valley below while the summit remained in clean sunlight. The cedar forest provided the deep quiet that forest provides, the absorption of sound and the dampening of wind, the sense of being held and sheltered by something ancient and indifferent to human affairs. The current head monk is a man in his late 50s named Ian. He has been at this temple since he was 9 years old, when his family, who were poor farmers in a village 2 days' walk from here, brought him to the temple and left him in the care of the monks, as was common for families who could not support all their children and who saw the monastic life as both a practical solution and a genuine spiritual opportunity. Ian does not remember his family with bitterness. He remembers his mother's face on the morning she left, the particular expression of someone maintaining composure against considerable internal pressure. And he feels for her now, across the decades, a love and a compassion that is cleaner and less complicated than what he might feel if he had been able to remain with her. The temple community is small, 12 monks in residence at present, ranging from Ian's own age down to 2 boys of 10 and 12 who have just arrived and who are still, in their quiet hours, visibly homesick. The community's day is organized around the rhythm of religious practice, the chanting of sutras at dawn and dusk, the meditation periods that punctuate the working hours, the physical labor of maintaining the temple and its grounds that occupies a significant portion of each day. There is wood to cut and carry, gardens to tend, the long stone stairway to sweep clear of fallen leaves and the accumulated debris of the cedars, the interior of the temple to clean, and the ritual objects to polish and the oil lamps to maintain. One of the monks, a young man named Ryokan, who has been at the temple for 5 years and who is known for his talent for calligraphy and his habit of wandering in the forest alone at dusk, has developed a practice of sitting on a particular flat stone at the edge of the forest that looks out over the valley. He does this in the evenings when the light is going and the valley below is filling with blue shadow while the mountains to the east still hold the last gold of the day. He sits on the stone without any particular program, not formally meditating in the technical sense, just sitting, watching the light change, watching the shadows move across the paddies, watching the smoke rise from cooking fires in the village below. He has been doing this long enough to know the patterns. He knows where the first light of dawn touches the valley in different seasons. He knows where the autumn color comes first and moves through the forest in waves of yellow and orange and deep red as October progresses. He knows the paths of the birds that migrate through the valley each spring and autumn, has learned to recognize certain individuals by their flight patterns, which sounds like something a scientist might do and is in fact something that just happened naturally over years of paying attention. The Buddhist teaching that forms the foundation of his practice says that everything is impermanent, that attachment to things as if they were permanent is the root of suffering, and that the recognition of impermanence rather than being a cause for despair can be a source of deep freedom. Ryokan has heard this teaching explained many times by Ayan, and has read it in many sutras, and has thought about it extensively without being sure he understands it. But on the flat stone in the evening, watching the light change, something that feels like understanding arrives without being pursued. The light changes and the valley changes, and the season is changing too. Summer giving way to autumn, and it is happening right now, not in some abstract future, but in this moment. And watching it, he feels not sadness exactly, but something that includes sadness and also includes gratitude and also includes something else, something for which he does not have a word. The particular emotion of being present for something beautiful and temporary that is both entirely itself and somehow more than itself. This, he thinks, is what the teaching is pointing at. Not the idea of impermanence, but this. Part 7. Women of the Village and the Castle. Let us return to the village now, and let us pay particular attention to the women, because any account of medieval Japan that attends primarily to the samurai and the monks is attending primarily to the men. And the women of medieval Japan had lives that were both constrained by the social order they lived in, and rich with their own particular forms of agency, skill, and meaning. Hana, whom we met earlier at her morning fire, is one of the most capable people in the village. This is recognized, if not always articulated, by everyone around her. She manages the household with an efficiency and a foresight that her husband and children depend on absolutely, making decisions about food preservation and storage that will determine whether the family has enough to eat through the winter, managing the household's relationships with neighbors and relatives through the elaborate system of exchange and mutual obligation that was the social infrastructure of medieval Japanese village life, raising children while also working in the fields, maintaining the household's spiritual life through the small daily rituals of Shinto practice and the occasional visits to the Buddhist temple, and doing all of this within a social framework that gave her very little formal authority and a great deal of actual responsibility. Medieval Japan was a patriarchal society, like every medieval society we have discussed in this series. Women were legally subordinate to men, had limited formal rights, and were expected to defer to fathers and then husbands in the formal conduct of their lives. At the same time, the practical realities of agricultural and domestic life gave women enormous latitude within the household, and the household was where most of life was actually conducted. Hana's decisions about how the family's rice surplus was to be used, which relationships with neighboring households needed strengthening, which children's education required investment, how the winter's preserved vegetables were to be rationed. These decisions shaped her family's survival in ways that no formal authority structure can fully capture. Among the women of the village, certain skills and knowledge were particularly valued. The making and maintenance of cloth was one. Medieval Japanese women, particularly in farming communities, were responsible for the production of the household's clothing, which meant spinning thread, weaving fabric, cutting, sewing, and repairing garments in an endless cycle of production that was woven into the daily and seasonal rhythm of life. The silk industry, which was important in many parts of Japan, required the raising of silkworms on mulberry leaves, the harvesting and processing of cocoons, the reeling of silk thread, and then the weaving of the thread into cloth, all of which was skilled and demanding work that was primarily women's work. A woman in the village named Tama, which means jewel, was considered the finest weaver in the valley. She had learned from her mother, and her mother had learned from her mother. And the knowledge that came down through that lineage included not just the mechanics of weaving, but the design of patterns, the mixing of dyes from plant materials, and the particular quality of attention that made the difference between cloth that was merely functional and cloth that was beautiful. Tama's cloth was sought after beyond the village, and the small income it generated gave her family a degree of economic flexibility that most farming households did not have. She wove in the mornings, before the heat of the day made the work uncomfortable, sitting at a loom that her father had built and that her husband had repaired several times over the years. The sound of the loom was one of the characteristic sounds of the village, part of the acoustic landscape of the domestic world, the way the sound of the river or the wind in the cedar forest was part of the landscape outside. The shuttle moving back and forth, the beater pressing each row of weft into place. The treadles operated by foot in a rhythm that Tama had internalized so deeply that she barely thought about it. Her attention free to focus on the emerging pattern, on adjusting the tension of threads, on planning the next sequence of colors. In the castle above the valley, the lives of the women who lived there were different in circumstance, but not entirely different in character. The Lord's wife, a woman of considerable education and social intelligence named Tomoe, managed the domestic and social life of the castle compound with an authority that was real even if it was not formally acknowledged. She was responsible for the welfare of the women and girls who served in the household, for the management of the castle's domestic economy, for the cultivation of the social relationships that bound the lord's household to the households of allied lords, and for the education of her own children in the values and practices that would prepare them for their adult roles. Tomoe had received a substantial education before her marriage, as daughters of samurai families of some standing often did. She could read and write, which placed her immediately in a small minority of the population. She had studied poetry and music and the tea ceremony, and she had a genuine passion for literature that her adult life had not entirely suppressed, though it had given her limited time to indulge it. She kept a personal diary in the tradition of aristocratic Japanese women's writing, a tradition with deep roots going back to the great court diarists of the Heian period. Women like Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon, who had produced some of the most remarkable literary works in the Japanese language. Tomoe's diary was not public and was not intended for any reader but herself, and in it she wrote with a freedom and a directness that her public social performance did not allow. She wrote about the difficulty of a particular conversation with the Lord. She wrote about her homesickness for her family's home in a northern province. She wrote about the beauty of the garden on an autumn morning when the maple tree beside the stone lantern had reached the peak of its color, the leaves burning red in a way that made her stop and look and feel something she couldn't quite name. That feeling between beauty and loss that the Japanese had a word for and that she had been trying to find the center of for as long as she could remember. She wrote, "The maple is at its most beautiful today. The red so intense it seems to give off light rather than reflect it. I stood at the window for a long time looking at it. My servant came to tell me that the morning tasks were waiting and I did not want to turn away. What is this feeling? It is not sadness, although it contains sadness. It is not joy, although it contains joy. It is something that the maple makes necessary, as if the tree were demanding that I feel it properly before it is gone." She closed the diary and went to attend to the morning tasks. Part 8. The Marketplace. Not far from the village, at a crossroads where two small roads met at a flat piece of ground beside the river, there was a market. It met on the 1st and 15th day of each month, which in the lunar calendar that medieval Japan used meant twice a month, roughly every 2 weeks. and its presence was one of the things that connected the scattered farming settlements of the valley to one another and to the wider world of goods and information that flowed along the roads. The market at the river crossroads was not large. It was a gathering of perhaps 30 or 40 stalls on a good day, selling a range of goods that reflected the productive specializations of the valley and the trade routes that connected it to larger centers. There was rice, of course, and other agricultural produce. There were the crafts produced in the village workshops, pottery and wooden implements and woven cloth. There were goods brought by traveling merchants from farther away, iron tools and salt and dried fish from the coast, medicines made from herbs and minerals, cloth of qualities and patterns not available locally, and occasionally more exotic items, objects made in the capital or imported from China or Korea, that sat among the local goods like visitors from another world. The market was also, and perhaps primarily, a social event. In a landscape where settlements were small and scattered and communication was slow and difficult, the market day was one of the few regular occasions when people from different villages and different households came together in one place. The exchange of goods was real and important, but it was accompanied by an exchange of information, of news and rumor and gossip, of the social intelligence that people living in isolated communities needed to maintain their awareness of the larger world. A merchant named Goro traveled the markets of this region on a regular circuit, arriving at one market and then another on his rounds, carrying a pack of goods on a wooden frame strapped to his back that he had bought cheaply in one place to sell for a small profit in another. Goro was a man of about 45, lean and weathered from years of walking, with a detailed knowledge of roads and weather and the social conditions of every settlement within a week's walk in any direction. He knew which lords were in conflict with which neighbors. He knew which villages had had good harvests and which had not. He knew which households were looking to buy certain things and which had certain things to sell, and he was skilled at connecting these needs and supplies in ways that produced small profits for himself and genuine value for the people he traded with. Traveling merchants in medieval Japan occupied a paradoxical social position. They were below farmers in the formal hierarchy of Confucian social theory, ranked with craftsmen in the class of productive workers who were themselves below warriors. But in practice, merchants were both indispensable and distrusted. They were indispensable because the distribution of goods that they facilitated was genuinely necessary for communities that could not produce everything they needed within their own boundaries. They were distrusted because they were mobile in a society that was largely fixed, because they moved between communities and therefore owed full loyalty to none, because the profit they made seemed to some observers to come from clever exchange rather than genuine production, and because their knowledge of conditions across a wide area gave them a kind of power that was hard to control. Goro was aware of his ambiguous status and had learned to navigate it with the same practical intelligence that he applied to every other aspect of his trade. He was careful in how he dressed, not too well and not too poorly. He was careful in how he spoke to people of different social positions, calibrating the degree of deference appropriately. He was generous with information in ways that built relationships without giving away the competitive advantages that made information valuable. He had learned, through decades of practice, to be useful without being threatening, visible without being conspicuous, present without being intrusive. At the market today, he was selling, among other things, a small quantity of indigo dye that he had obtained in a town 3 days' walk to the south, where a craftsman made it from plants grown in the warmer climate of the southern coast. The indigo was expensive and not something most people at this market could afford. But Tama the weaver had asked him to bring it on his last visit, had given him money to acquire it, and he had done so and was now delivering it as promised. The transaction between Goro and Tama was brief and conducted with the particular efficiency of people who have done business together before and trust each other, which is to say with very little haggling and a great deal of clarity about what was being exchanged for what. Tama examined the indigo carefully, testing its quality with a small scratch of her thumbnail and examining the color of the mark it left, nodded with satisfaction, paid Goro the agreed amount, and added a small additional gift of pickled plum that she had brought for this purpose. The gift was not required and was not a payment. It was an acknowledgement of a relationship, a small gesture that said, I value this connection we have built, and I want it to continue. Goro received it with a bow and a genuine feeling of warmth toward this woman who wove the most beautiful cloth in the valley. Part 9. The Tea Ceremony. In the castle above the valley, on an afternoon when the light was soft and no urgent business required attention, Tomo prepared for a tea ceremony. She had been a student of tea since her girlhood, and had continued the practice throughout her adult life with a consistency that surprised some people who knew how busy her days were. The tea ceremony was not, she had tried to explain to a skeptical cousin once, a luxury she indulged when time permitted. It was more like breathing, something that the rest of her life was organized around rather than something fitted into the gaps. The practice of tea that had developed in Japan, taking Chinese tea drinking as its starting point and transforming it into something distinctly Japanese, was in the medieval period associated particularly with Zen Buddhism and with the warrior class that had become Zen Buddhism's most important patron. The connection between the tea ceremony and Zen was not accidental or merely superficial. The tea ceremony, as developed by its great masters, particularly the master Sen no Rikyu who would perfect it in the 16th century, was a practice of aesthetic and spiritual refinement that shared its deepest assumptions with Zen, including the valuing of simplicity over ornamentation, the attention to the present moment as the only real moment, the finding of beauty in imperfect and impermanent things. The room where Tomo practiced tea was small. This was deliberate. The great tea masters had theorized at length about the correct size of the tea room, and the consensus had converged on something very small indeed, a space that forced a kind of intimacy and that removed the guest from the visual and psychological scale of the larger world. You entered through a low door that required you to bow, which was partly a practical consequence of the door's size and partly a deliberate symbolic act. The lowering of the head, the reduction of scale, the leaving behind of whatever social position you occupied in the world outside. Inside the room there was an alcove, the tokonoma, where a single hanging scroll was displayed, a painting or a piece of calligraphy chosen for the season and the occasion. Today's scroll showed a branch of autumn leaves in ink wash, 3 or 4 leaves in different stages of their turning, rendered with the economy of means that ink wash painting achieved, where the empty paper was as important as the mark, where what was left out was as significant as what was put in. There was a small iron kettle on a bed of ash in the floor, the water in it already beginning to move with the first suggestion of heat, making a sound that the tea practitioners described as wind in the pines. There was a ceramic tea bowl, thick-walled and slightly irregular, glazed in a mottled gray-green that shaded toward brown at the foot. The bowl was not a precious or expensive object in the way that value was commonly measured. It was not decorated with gold or fine-painted scenes, but it had been made by a craftsman whose work Tomo had sought out specifically. A potter in a village not far from the capital who made bowls in a style that found beauty in simplicity and irregularity and the natural variation of materials and fire. The bowl fit her hands in a way that felt intentional, which she knew was impossible, that the potter could not have made this bowl for her hands, but which she felt nonetheless. She made the tea slowly. Each movement was practiced and clear, without hurry, without the performing of hurry that was so characteristic of her daily life. She scooped the tea powder from its container with the bamboo scoop and placed it in the bowl. She poured the hot water, lifted from the kettle with the bamboo ladle, and whisked the tea to a smooth green foam with the bamboo whisk, the slight hiss of it audible in the small, silent room. Then she set the bowl before her and looked at it for a moment before drinking. The tea was bitter and vivid and warm. She held the bowl in both hands and drank it slowly, and when she was finished, she looked at the bowl again, and then at the scroll in the alcove, and then at the thin line of garden visible through the paper screen, a rectangle of green pine branch against pale sky. And she was, for the duration of that looking, entirely present and entirely quiet, and entirely without the thoughts that otherwise followed her everywhere. Part 10. The Seasons and Their Ceremonies. Medieval Japanese life was organized by the seasons in a way that went far beyond the agricultural necessity of planting and harvest that we have already discussed. The seasons were marked by a rich calendar of religious and cultural observances, festivals and ceremonies that gave the year its emotional and spiritual shape, and that connected the communities of living people to the generations who had come before them and to the natural world that surrounded and sustained them. Spring was the season of new beginnings, and also of the cherry blossoms, the hanami, the flower viewing, which was not a modern innovation but had deep roots in medieval and earlier Japanese culture. The cherry trees bloomed for only a short time, sometimes only a week, and their blooming was watched for and anticipated with an attention that seems, to outside observers, extraordinary for something that is, after all, just a tree flowering. But the cherry blossoms were not just flowers. They were the most beautiful expression of the season, and their brevity was inseparable from their beauty. And going to sit beneath them and watch them and compose poems about them was a way of practicing the central spiritual exercise that the Japanese aesthetic tradition required, the full presence to beauty in the knowledge of its passing. In the castle compound above the valley, the cherry trees that had been planted in the inner garden were watched by everyone. Their progress from bare branches to bud, to early flower to full bloom, tracked with the attention that the first flowers of spring inevitably commanded. When they were at their peak, the Lord would invite his senior retainers and their families to sit in the garden and drink sake and compose verses, which sounds festive and is festive, but the verses composed at Hanami were not celebratory in a simple sense. They were attempts to say something true about beauty and impermanence, and the ones that succeeded were the ones that found language for the feeling that Tomo had described in her diary, the feeling that was not sadness and not joy, but something that included both and exceeded both. In the village below, the Hanami was less formal. The farmers went to sit under the large cherry tree at the edge of the settlement that had been there for generations, whose flowering was watched for as a weather indicator as much as an aesthetic event, since the timing of the blossoms was connected in the farmer's empirical knowledge with the timing of the optimal planting season. They brought rice cakes and sake and sat on mats spread on the ground and looked at the flowers and talked, and the children played among the falling petals, and the old people sat quietly and felt whatever they felt, which nobody tried to put into words because the feeling was too large for ordinary speech. Summer brought the Obon festival, when the spirits of the ancestors were believed to return to visit the living, when the household altars were tended with particular care and offerings left for the returning dead, when lanterns were floated on rivers to light the way for the spirits returning to the other world at the festival's end. The floating of the lanterns on the river at the end of Obon was one of the most visually striking of all the medieval Japanese ceremonies. Hundreds of small paper lanterns with candles inside them set loose on the current, moving downstream in a slow procession of light, the reflections trembling on the dark water, the community standing on the banks watching them go. And the watching had the quality of a prolonged farewell, of saying goodbye to something that you knew would return next year, but that was nevertheless leaving now, and that leaving was real. Autumn brought the harvest, and with it the harvest festivals, the celebrations that mark the successful completion of another year's agricultural labor, that were also expressions of gratitude to the natural forces that had cooperated, the rain and the sun and the warmth that the rice required. The autumn was also the season of the most intense color, the momiji gari, the maple leaf viewing, which had the same relationship to the autumn leaves that hanami had to the cherry blossoms. The Japanese maple turning in autumn produced colors of extraordinary intensity, and the correct response was to go and sit among them and look and feel. Hana, who had very little time in her daily life for the contemplative cultivation of aesthetic experience, found that she could not entirely ignore the autumn maples even so. There was a small grove of them on the slope above the village, just below the cedar forest, and they turned each October in a sequence that she knew by heart. The ones on the south-facing slope going first, the ones sheltered by the cedars going last, the whole process taking about 3 weeks from first color to last fallen leaf. She passed the grove on the path to the upper fields, and on the days when the color was at its peak, she slowed her step without deciding to, and looked without particularly meaning to look, and felt something that was not relief from the work of her life, but was not separate from it either. That was part of the same attention and engagement with the world that made her good at what she did. The ability to see what was actually there rather than only what you were looking for. Part 11. The Buddhist monk's daily life. Let us return to the temple on the mountainside and spend some time understanding what a day in that community actually looked like. Because the monastic life of medieval Japan was one of the most distinctive and influential aspects of the whole culture. The monks rose before dawn. This was not a choice or a discipline that required conscious effort after the first years. After years of this schedule, the body simply woke at the appropriate time, the same way a farmer's body woke at first light regardless of whether an alarm was set. Ian, the head monk, had not needed to deliberately wake himself in decades. He opened his eyes in the dark at the correct time and lay still for a few moments, attending to the quality of the silence, which was different in different seasons and different weather conditions. And then he rose. The morning chanting began before sunrise, the community gathering in the main hall of the temple in their gray robes, kneeling on the wooden floor, the oil lamps lit, the altar visible in the lamp's warm light with its gilded figures and its fresh flowers, and the incense burning in its holder. The chanting of sutras was done in a stylized way with a specific tone and rhythm, and to hear it was to feel immediately its hypnotic quality, the repetition and the controlled breath and the specific resonance of the voices in the wooden room creating a kind of sound environment that was very different from ordinary speech, and that acted on the nervous system in ways that were not entirely unlike what meditation aimed at. After the morning chanting, there was a period of formal sitting meditation, zazen, which Zen Buddhism had made central to its practice, and which was one of the most demanding and most subtle things that the monks did. Sitting without moving in the correct posture, attending to the experience of sitting without trying to think anything in particular, remaining alert without straining toward alertness, was something that sounded simple and was in practice anything but. The mind that sat down to meditate without any particular instruction or experience found itself immediately in a landscape of incessant thought, of planning and remembering and fantasizing and worrying, all of it apparently arising without invitation, and apparently impossible to stop. The teaching of Zen was that the stopping was not the point. The point was something subtler than stopping, a different relationship to the arising of thoughts that was neither engagement with them nor suppression of them. Ian spent 40 years trying to understand this and had arrived at what he would describe, if pressed, as a provisional understanding that felt more like a direction than a destination. He was not enlightened, whatever that meant. He was a man in his 50s who had spent most of his life sitting still in a wooden room and who had learned, gradually and unevenly and with many reversions, to be somewhat less enslaved to the movements of his own mind than he had been as a young man. This was not nothing. In fact, from inside the experience of it, it was a great deal. The reduction of what the Buddhists called suffering, which was not just pain, but the specifically mental suffering caused by attachment and aversion, and the endless narrative commentary that the mind generates about everything that happens, was real and perceptible. Not as a constant state of bliss, but as a shift in the quality of ordinary experience. A slight but significant lightening that made the same circumstances less oppressive and the same pleasures more complete. After meditation, there was a simple breakfast, rice and pickled vegetables and miso soup, eaten in silence with attention in a style that the Zen tradition called oryoki, where the eating itself was a form of practice, each action performed with full awareness. After breakfast, there was work. The work of the temple community was substantial and varied. There was the maintenance of the temple buildings and grounds, the cutting and stacking of firewood for the winter, the tending of the kitchen garden that provided vegetables for the community's use, the sweeping of the long stone stairway that led up through the cedar forest, the cleaning of the interior of the temple, the preparation of offerings for the altar. The young monk Ryokan was assigned to the kitchen garden today, which meant spending several hours weeding and watering in a small enclosed area behind the main hall, where the monks grew the vegetables that supplemented their otherwise austere diet. He worked methodically and with reasonable cheerfulness, talking occasionally with the older monk who was working beside him, a man named Sosho who had been at the temple even longer than Ian, and who had the quality of stillness and movement that long practice produced. A way of performing physical labor that looked effortless because it was so exactly matched to what the task required. No excess, no strain. Sosho told Ryokan a story while they weeded. It was a story about a famous Zen master who had been asked by a student what enlightenment was, and who had replied by saying, "Have you eaten your breakfast?" And when the student said yes, the master said, "Then wash your bowl." The story was a koan, a teaching puzzle without a logical solution, intended not to inform the rational mind but to destabilize it, to point towards something that could not be approached directly. Ryokan had heard this story before and had thought about it and had not arrived at an understanding that felt complete. He thought about it again now while weeding and then set it aside and simply weeded, and the weeding was straightforward and physical and entirely itself. And perhaps that was the point. Part 12. The Art of the Sword. The training yard of the castle was a large open space of packed earth, surrounded on 3 sides by a covered gallery where observers could watch, and on the 4th side by the outer wall of the compound. Early in the morning it was occupied by the young warriors in their training, and the sounds that came from it were unmistakable and constant. The sharp crack of wooden practice swords making contact, the stamp of feet on earth, the controlled breathing of men working at peak physical exertion, and occasionally the voice of the instructor correcting a posture or demanding another repetition. The sword in medieval Japan was much more than a weapon. It was the defining object of the samurai's identity and the center of an elaborate tradition of skill and philosophy that had been developing for centuries. The katana, the curved single-edged sword that is the most recognizable object of Japanese martial culture, was itself a remarkable piece of technology. Its characteristic properties of sharpness and flexibility and durability, the product of a sophisticated metallurgical tradition that had evolved specifically to address the particular challenges of the Japanese sword. The making of a katana was itself a ritual process. The swordsmith who made a quality blade observed religious purifications before and during the work, treated the forge as a sacred space, and brought to the physical work of hammering and folding and tempering the steel a quality of attention and intention that was continuous with the religious and aesthetic values of the broader culture. A blade was not just a blade. It was the product of a particular person's skill and attention at a particular moment, and the best blades were believed to have a quality that transcended mere technical excellence, a kind of spiritual presence that their owners could perceive. Takeshi, the young samurai we met earlier, was not yet working with a real blade in his practice. He was still at the stage of training with a bakken, a practice sword of solid wood, which was dangerous enough when used with full power but did not carry the lethal risk of the real thing. His training was supervised by an older warrior named Kato, who had been in the Lord's service for 30 years and who had fought in several small but serious engagements, and who brought to his teaching the particular authority of someone whose knowledge of the subject was not theoretical. Cato's method was not gentle. He demanded that the forms be executed with full commitment, not at half power or half speed as a concession to the student's development. His theory was that the only way to learn what a full-power sword movement actually felt like was to practice at full power, and that the corrections made to incorrect form under the safety of the wooden sword would translate directly to correct form with the real blade. He was also, within this demanding framework, precise and patient in his explanation of what was required and why. A teacher who was hard to work with and from whom a great deal could be learned. On this morning, Takeshi was working on a sequence of cuts that began from a specific guard position and moved through 3 distinct cuts to a specific ending position. The whole sequence designed to be performed both alone as a kata, a form practice, and in paired practice with an opponent. He had practiced the sequence hundreds of times. He was beginning to be able to perform it with something approaching smoothness, the 3 cuts flowing from one to the next without the visible hesitation that had marked his earlier attempts. Kato watched him perform the sequence twice and then stopped him with a word. The 3rd cut, he said, was wrong. Not wrong in the mechanics, which were now mostly correct, but wrong in something more fundamental. You are performing the end of the sequence with your mind already at the end of the sequence, he said. You are finishing before you are finished. The 3rd cut must be complete in itself, not a transition to the stopping. Each movement must be whole. Takeshi stood still and thought about this. He understood it as an idea. He did not yet know how to do it. He performed the sequence again, trying to attend to what Kato had described, trying to make the 3rd cut whole in itself, and felt something shift very slightly, the sword arriving at its end position with a quality that was different from before, more settled, more finished, not yet right, but different from before. Kato said nothing. This was also a teaching. Part 13. The night fell quickly in the valley, the mountains cutting off the late light and bringing darkness sooner than it would come in a flatter landscape. The cooking fires in the village were lit in the late afternoon, and the smoke from them rose straight in the still evening air, the first darkness of the valley filling up around the soft orange glow of the fires, while the sky above was still pale. In Hana's house, the family gathered for the evening meal as the last light faded. The rice was ready, kept warm over the low embers. There was a soup of miso and vegetables and a small dish of pickled things. And that was the meal. The children ate with the concentrated seriousness of people who had worked hard all day and were genuinely hungry. And the conversation was the ordinary conversation of a family at the end of a long day. Reports on what had been done and what remained to do. A question from one of the children about something they had seen in the fields. Kenji describing a decision he had made about the irrigation channel that needed repair before the spring planting. After the meal, the children helped with the cleaning and then settled to their respective evening occupations. The oldest boy was studying, working through the characters of a text that the village priest had set him, trying to improve his literacy in preparation for a future that might take him beyond the farming life. The oldest girl was sewing, adding to the small collection of items she was assembling as part of the preparation for her eventual marriage. The younger children sat near the fire and listened to grandmother, who was telling a story about the forest spirits, the Kodama who lived in the ancient trees and who required careful respect and correct behavior from the humans who lived near them. The story was not simply entertainment, though it was entertaining. It was a form of moral education, teaching through narrative the values and behaviors that kept a person in right relationship with the world. The forest spirits in the story rewarded those who behaved correctly and punished those who did not, and the definition of correct behavior that the story offered was specific and practical. Do not take more from the forest than you need. Leave something of what you find. Speak respectfully to the old trees. Do not disturb the spaces where the spirits live. These were the values of a community that depended on the forest for firewood and building material and food, and that had developed over generations an ethic of careful use that was encoded in stories rather than regulations. Hana sat near the fire after the children were settled and let herself simply sit for a few minutes before sleep. This was a luxury that she rarely allowed herself. The simple fact of sitting without doing anything. The fire was low and warm. The sound of her children's quiet activity was around her. The house was as it should be. Outside, she could hear the river moving over its stones, a sound so constant that she normally did not hear it at all. The way you stop hearing the clock on the wall after the first few days in a new house. But tonight, for some reason, she heard it. The low, continuous presence of the water moving in the dark. And it was comforting in a way she could not have explained. She thought briefly about the day, about the work that had been done and the work that remained, and then she let those thoughts go and simply listened to the river and the fire and the breathing of her household around her, and felt something that was not happiness exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular quality of being at rest in a life that was your own, however difficult that life might be. In the castle above the valley, Tomoe was writing in her diary by candlelight in the small room that she used for this purpose. She wrote about the day, about a conversation she had had with her youngest child, about the state of the garden as the autumn advanced. She wrote, "Autumn is deepening now. The mornings are cold enough that I see my breath when I rise. The maples are turning faster, and I know that in another week or two the color will be gone. And what was so beautiful will be bare branches, and what was so present will be past. I do not feel sad about this, or I feel sad in the way that feels correct, the way that is part of seeing clearly rather than a failure of seeing. In the temple on the mountainside, Ian sat alone in the main hall after the other monks had gone to sleep. In the dark, except for a single lamp burning before the altar. He was not meditating formally. He was simply sitting in the dark in a place that he had sat in for nearly 50 years, with the familiar smell of incense and old wood and the faint sound of the wind in the cedars outside. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was simply present in a room that had held the presence of generations of monks before him, in a tradition of practice that reached back centuries, in a world that was impossibly large and that he understood incompletely, and that was, in this moment, exactly as it was, and nothing more needed. Outside the temple, Ryokan had walked one last time to his flat stone at the edge of the forest. The valley below was dark, the lights of the village invisible at this distance. The stars were very clear. He could see the Milky Way, which he knew was a river of innumerable stars so far away that no individual star could be distinguished. And he knew also that this knowledge was different from looking at it. That looking at it produced something in him that the knowledge did not produce. A specific quality of feeling in response to specific beauty that was one of the things that made being alive and having eyes strange and remarkable and worthwhile. The autumn air was cold and smelled of cedar and turning leaves and the faint mineral tang of the mountain above. An owl called from somewhere in the forest, the sound carrying clearly in the still night air. Far below, the river moved over its stones in the dark. The stars were steady. Ryokan sat on the flat stone and was still, and the night held him as a night holds everything that is patient enough to remain in it, without judgment, without preference, with the absolute acceptance that the natural world offers to whatever is present within it. Part 14. The Poetry of Small Things. One of the most remarkable things about medieval Japanese culture was the degree to which poetry was not a specialized activity of educated elites, but something that permeated the entire social fabric, from the imperial court to the provincial warrior household, to, in some forms, even the farming village. The tradition of Japanese poetry was ancient and diverse, but the form that had the deepest roots in the medieval period was the waka, a short poem of 31 syllables arranged in 5 lines. The waka had been the primary vehicle of Japanese poetic expression for centuries, and its conventions were so well established that almost everyone with any education had some facility with the form, the way that educated people in early modern Europe might be expected to have some ability to write a sonnet or a Latin epigram. Writing a waka in response to the seasons, to a landscape, to a particular emotional experience, was not primarily a literary ambition, but a social and spiritual practice, a way of attending to experience with sufficient seriousness to find words for it. Tomoe wrote waka regularly in her diary and in letters to family and friends. When she wrote about the maple turning in October, she would often find the prose giving way to a short poem, not because she was trying to be literary, but because the poem could do something the prose could not, could hold the feeling at a particular angle where you could see it clearly, the way a certain slant of light makes visible things that are invisible in full sun. She wrote one morning about the dew on the garden stones before sunrise, how it disappeared so quickly after the sun touched it, and the poem she found for this was 4 lines about looking for what was there a moment ago, about the way the search for the vanished thing was itself a form of presence. She was not particularly satisfied with it, but the act of trying had made her attend to the dew more completely than she would have otherwise. And the dew was there, brief and cold and perfect in the early light, and it was enough. Below in the village, the connection to the formal poetic tradition was thinner but not absent. The songs that Yuki sang in the rice paddy were themselves a form of poetry, carrying within their rhythms and images the same fundamental attention to the natural world and its transience that the more sophisticated literary poetry expressed. The harvest songs that the village sang at the autumn festival were poetry of a sort, even if they had never been written down, even if no one thought of them as poems. They were language shaped by attention to experience, the language of people who had been paying very close attention to the rice and the seasons and the labor of the body for a very long time, and who had found, in the making of these songs, a way to hold all of that attention in a form that could be shared and passed on. The monk Ryokan, who in his later years would become one of the most beloved poets in the Japanese tradition, was in our story still a young man sitting on a flat stone watching the sky and not yet knowing that the observations he was making on those evenings would one day find their way into poems that people would still be reading centuries later. He was simply watching, simply feeling, simply being present to the extraordinary ordinary fact of being a living creature on a mountainside under stars. The poetry would come later, as the expression of what the watching had taught him. But the watching came first. The poetry was always, in Japan as elsewhere, the fruit of attention rather than its source. This is perhaps the most important lesson that medieval Japanese culture, at its best, offers to us across the centuries. Not a specific set of beliefs or practices, not the tea ceremony or the sword or the Zen garden as things to be imitated, but the underlying commitment to paying attention, to bringing full presence to whatever is happening, whether it is raking gravel or transplanting rice or looking at the autumn leaves or writing a poem by candlelight in a small room at the end of a long day. The belief that this quality of attention was itself a form of spiritual practice, that it was not separate from the rest of life, but was the quality that made the rest of life whole. Part 14. The Zen Garden. In the temple, there was a garden. It was not large, perhaps 20 paces by 12, enclosed on all four sides by low walls and the back of the main hall and the monks' quarters. It contained no plants. There was a large, irregular stone at one end, dark and rough-surfaced, half buried in the ground as if it had always been there. There was a smaller stone at the other end, and between them the ground was covered with raked gravel, pale gray, raked in careful parallel lines around the two stones. The lines in the gravel followed the shape of the stones, curving around them the way water follows the shape of a rock in a river, and this was in fact one of the interpretations the garden invited. The stones as islands, the gravel as water, or as the sea. The whole thing as a compressed and distilled version of a landscape, not a representation, but something more like an essence. Ayan maintained the garden himself. He had done so for 30 years, since the previous head monk had died and left the garden in his care. He raked it in the morning, after meditation, moving slowly around the enclosed space with a wide wooden rake, drawing the parallel lines in the gravel with a concentration that was not different from his meditation. The quality of attention required to rake the lines evenly, to follow the curves correctly around the stones, to maintain the consistency of the pattern across the whole space, was specific and total. A kind of focused presence that had no room in it for anything other than the gravel and the rake and the movement of the one through the other. He had been asked many times, by visitors and by students, what the garden meant. He had tried various answers over the years and had found all of them inadequate, which he eventually came to believe was not a failure of explanation, but a correct assessment of the garden's nature. It did not mean something in the way that a painting of a recognizable scene meant something, or a story meant something. It was more like a question than an answer, more like a silence than a statement. It created conditions in which something might arise in the mind of the person who sat with it long enough and quietly enough. And what arose was the person's own, not the garden's. He raked the morning's gravel in the autumn light, the raking going quickly in the straight sections and more slowly and carefully around the curves of the stones, the gravel responding differently in different parts of the garden where the depth varied slightly. And when he was done, he stood at the edge and looked at what he had made, which was the same as what he had made the day before and the year before and the 10 years before, and it was sufficient. It was itself. It was raked gravel around two dark stones, and it was the morning, and he was an old monk in a gray robe with a wooden rake, and these were the facts of the moment, and the moment was complete. Part 15. The Last Light. As we come to the end of our time in medieval Japan, dear listener, let us allow the images and the stories to settle like the dust that settles in a Japanese farmhouse at the end of a long day, drifting slowly down through the air into a fine layer over every surface, becoming part of the place itself. We have walked today through a world that is gone now, or gone in the form we have been looking at. The rice paddies are still there in Japan, though many fewer than there once were, and the rhythm of rice cultivation still follows the same basic calendar of preparation and planting and harvest that it has followed for 2,000 years. The mountains are still there, and the cedar forests, and the rivers running through the valleys. Some of the temples are still standing, their cedar wood replaced many times over, but their bones the same bones, on the same hillside, approached by the same long stairways through the same ancient forest. And in the living Japanese culture, the traces of the medieval world are still present in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes remarkably direct. The tea ceremony is still practiced, still using much the same objects and following much the same forms that Tomo practiced in her small room above the garden. The art of the sword is still practiced, in forms that preserve the basic forms of the medieval training, even though the context has entirely changed. The Zen garden still exists, many of them, and people still come to sit in front of them and look at raked gravel around dark stones and feel whatever they feel. The seasons are still observed in Japan with an attention that visitors from other cultures often find striking. The cherry blossoms still stop the country for their brief season, still fill the parks with people sitting on mats looking up, still generate the vast outpouring of observation and verse and feeling that has been their due for 1,000 years. The autumn leaves still command the same attention. The first snow still matters in a way that the calendar's marking of a seasonal change does not, in itself, fully explain. Something from the medieval world survived in the culture because it was deep enough to survive. The sensitivity to the beauty of transient things. The awareness of impermanence not as tragedy, but as the condition that makes presence necessary. The finding of meaning in the careful performance of ordinary tasks. The cultivation of the quality of attention as a form of both spiritual and aesthetic discipline. These are not uniquely Japanese ideas, not uniquely Buddhist ones. They are recognizably human, available in principle to any person anywhere. But in medieval Japan, they were articulated and practiced with a particular richness and depth that the culture has passed down through the centuries to us. We are very far, most of us, from the texture of that daily life. We do not rise before dawn to tend rice paddies. We do not sit for hours each morning in a wooden hall chanting sutras or trying to find our way through the mystery of a Zen koan. We do not spend our days making cloth or raking gravel or copying poems with a bamboo brush, trying to find the quality of attention that makes the practice whole rather than merely correct. But we are not entirely far from the feeling that Hana had sitting by her fire in the dark, listening to the river. We are not entirely far from what Ryokan felt on his flat stone, looking at the Milky Way in the clear mountain air. We are not entirely far from the feeling Tomo described in her diary, the maple tree burning red, the emotion that was not sadness and not joy, but something that included both and exceeded both. We call it by different names in different languages and approach it through different practices and find it in different places. But the thing itself is the same thing, the awareness of being alive in a world of beautiful and impermanent things, the specific feeling of that awareness, the particular weight of it in the chest when something arrests your full attention and the world goes briefly very still and very complete. This, perhaps, is the truest thread connecting us to Hana and Ryokan and Tomoe, and the young samurai Takeshi practicing his sword forms in the early morning light. Not the specific forms of their lives, which are gone, but the quality of attention that the best of them brought to those lives. The willingness to be present, the capacity to find the moment complete. Take that with you into sleep tonight, dear listener. Whatever world you inhabit, whatever season your life is in right now, however far from where you wish to be, you find yourself at this particular moment. Let yourself be here. This moment, this breath, this particular quality of the dark around you and the warmth inside you and the sounds that reach you from wherever you are in the world. Somewhere in Japan right now, and it is always sometime in Japan, somewhere in the day or the night, someone is sitting in front of a garden of raked gravel and dark stones. Someone is preparing tea in a small room with a paper screen and a single hanging scroll. Someone is walking up a long stone stairway through cedar forest toward a temple where the incense has been burning for 500 years. Someone is sitting in a flooded rice paddy in the early morning cold and starting to sing, and the sound of it carries across the valley in the still spring air. And somewhere, tonight, a river is moving over stones in the dark. And that sound, which has been there longer than any human being who ever heard it, is still there, still moving, still the same sound it has always been, patient and constant and entirely itself. Let it carry you now, dear listener. Let all of it carry you. The mountains and the temples and the raked gravel and the river and the autumn leaves burning in the still October air. Let them all be the last things you hold before you release holding all together and drift and sleep. Good night. Sleep well, wherever in this world you are. And I will see you next time for another quiet journey through the corridors of history. Sweet dreams.